Good afternoon, 7th grade. It is Wednesday, April 8th. We are on page 357 in your world history book, section 23.3, Early Years of the War. As we had seen in yesterday's lesson, Hitler had broken his promise of just only taking that little sliver of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and has now invaded Poland, which has started World War II. The invasion of Poland was the world's first experience of blitzkrieg, which is German's word for a lightning war. This method of combat involved tanks coming in at lightning fast speeds, which Poland was ill-equipped for. Remember, Poland had horseback mounted people with swords and muskets against German tanks and machine guns, which did not bode well for Poland's success in this war. By September 17th, Poland had fallen to the Germans and Russians. During the winter of 1939 to 1940, Stalin forced the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to allow Russian military bases and troops within their border. Finland attempted resistance, but in a valiant fight was crushed. In April, the Nazis invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell within hours, but Norway held out until May. Holland fell in 5 days, and Belgium in 18. Once again, these countries did attempt to fight, but with the German war machine, they were unequipped. None of these other countries had been preparing for war, but remember, Hitler's factories were constantly churning out new tanks and weaponry. Germany was ready for a war, they weren't, and as we know, those prepared to fight usually succeed. Even before resistance had been crushed in Holland and Belgium, German troops began their assault on northern France. The German blitzkrieg was so swift and overwhelming that the British and French troops who had assembled in northern France to block the Nazi advance were soon pushed all the way to a little section of coast at the little port of Dunkirk on the English Channel. It seemed certain that the Allied armies would fall here and Hitler would take over all of Europe. But in a daring and courageous effort never to be forgotten, the British Royal Air Force held off the Germans long enough for hundreds of small British, not talking now about British naval boats, there were a few of them, but mainly just fishermen, helped get the Allied troops over to England. Once Dunkirk fell, though, the surrender of France was only a matter of time. The city of Paris fell on June 14, 1940. A new consolidating government headed by 84-year-old Marshal Henry Pétain came to power and immediately asked Hitler for an armistice. France was forced to bow to a purposefully humiliating defeat. In the same railroad dining car in which Germany had signed an armistice in 1918, the German forces forced France to form an armistice on June 22, 1940. Some patriotic Frenchmen escaped to Great Britain, where they organized a free French government under the leadership of General Charles de Gaulle. In the safety of England, de Gaulle trained French liberator troops and continued to assist the Allies throughout the war. With France under the Nazi boot, Hitler focused on Britain. Hitler and his Air Force commander, Marshal Hermann Göring, were confident that they could destroy Britain's Royal Air Force. And thus the Battle of Britain began. But to Hitler's surprise, Great Britain was able to hold off Hitler's advance. The Royal Air Force was a very brave group of pilots, and though many of them died, they were able to keep Hitler from invading Great Britain. But shortly, and people wonder, well, wasn't Neville Chamberlain? Remember, we talked about Neville Chamberlain in yesterday's lesson. He had been replaced by Winston Churchill. He became Prime Minister of Great Britain because people realized Winston Churchill was one of the few men who not only saw Hitler for who he was, but was not afraid of him. Winston Churchill stood his ground against Hitler. And this was known as the London Blitz, and it began in July of 1940. 10,000 bombs fell on the city in September alone. But the Royal Air Force destroyed so many German planes that Germany gave up daytime raids and focused on nighttime raids only. The courage of the British airmen was matched by that of the citizens of London. Even though they had evacuated all of the children, the people in London, they began to hold steadfast. They were ready. If the Germans landed on their cities, they were ready to put up a fight. So after Hitler kind of was like, well, not going to mess with Great Britain for now, he began to focus instead in Eastern Europe. In October of 1940, he abandoned his plan for an invasion of England and instead focused on Eastern Europe. So beginning in 1941, he conquered Yugoslavia and in Greece. Later, he conquered Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And of course, though, remember, he had signed that peace treaty with Joseph Stalin. But as I'd said before, they were both secretly plotting to betray the other. And when Hitler gave up on taking England, he turned his attention to Russia. But he made the same mistake that Napoleon had. He began to try to fight a war on two fronts and also forgot the cruelty of Russian winter. Nazi troops invaded Russia on June 22nd, 1941. This single event would be a determining factor in world history for the next 50 years. For the first 3 months, the invasion of Russia went remarkably well. By October, the Nazis had advanced as far as Leningrad in the north, and they had conquered the Baltic states and the Ukraine. Then, Hitler made the same blunder that Napoleon did. He tried to attack Moscow in winter. And just like Napoleon, Hitler's supply line, because remember, troops have to have food and supplies, was strained. Russian troops are used to fighting in a Russian winter. Germans, not so much. Many of them froze to death and starved as total war was fought. If the Russians had to retreat, no problem. They would burn everything to the ground, so there were no supplies for the Germans to get. The United States emerged from World War I confident, prosperous, and powerful. During the 1920s, most Americans did not want to get involved in world affairs. But in 1939, Americans opened their newspaper to learn that once again, Europe was at war. As the war progressed, Americans began to produce more and more weapons for they believed would eventually have to be used. And many Americans had hoped that this war would be over before it started. But then France fell, and Germany began the London Blitz. Now, only Britain was the only free nation in Europe that stood between possibly Germany and America. President Roosevelt believed that America should help Great Britain in its fight for survival. And then the Congress, of course, responded. Instead of just simply giving weapons, they passed the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed Great Britain to basically borrow and buy war materials with the promise of paying America back. This, of course, angered Germany. Germany was furious. How could America call itself neutral and yet sell weapons to its enemy, England? As 1941 drew to a close, tempers flared. German submarines began once again firing upon American merchant ships, and these ships began firing back at the German subs. These American ships learned their lesson during World War I. American merchant ships came prepared. But it was no secret, though. Remember, Japan at this time had also joined the Axis powers, and they began to view America as a potential threat, specifically the base of Pearl Harbor. In 1937, Japan had invaded China and began raging an undeclared war on that vast land. Japan had become militaristic, or in other words, they had an emperor, but they relied upon their military leaders instead. Though Emperor Hirohito was the authority figure, General Hideki Tojo was the real power in the country. And as a result, Japan began to view America as an enemy and declared an attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The Japanese made a surprise attack on the U.S. naval fleet and airfield at Pearl Harbor. Just before 8 a.m., waves of planes swooped down out of the sky as the sirens blared. Air raid, this is no drill. When the pilot of the lead plane, Mitsuo Fuchida, saw the battleships below him in neat, unprotected rows, he knew that they really had come in undetected, and thus they destroyed and killed 3,500 servicemen and many, many battleships. But thankfully, at this time, their main target, the aircraft carriers, were out practicing combat missions. So though many battleships were destroyed and many people killed, their main target had failed. And as a result, America declares war on December 8th. And of course, they vote yes. Japan had thought that this attack on Pearl Harbor would completely just disillusion America, that America would back away from even thinking to declare war. But it had the opposite effect. This spurred those who were neutral to realize No, there is no getting around this. America cannot choose to remain neutral. And thus America, the sleeping giant, as the Japanese military leaders had called it, awoke to fight on the side of the Allies against the Axis powers. Now guys, this is a really long section, so make sure you read all of 23.3. I covered most of the highlights, but I still need you to read it yourselves. Remember, on page 362, we have the section 23.3 review. Make sure you do odds only. That's it for today. I hope you guys have a good Wednesday, and I will see you tomorrow.